South Wales
See you, Laura.
is streaming ahead. Its vaccination rate is getting higher. We're still nowhere near that 70 or 80%. But, I mean, if we are in a lockdown and, you and I know it's been 10 weeks and we get to that 70 or 80%
Long 10 weeks.
rate, exactly, should New South Wales really have to wait for other states to catch up before we get freedom?
Well, I think we do need to stick to the National Cabinet Plan because that's been agreed by all states and states and territories, so the premiers and the chief ministers. But what that provides for is once the nation is at 70% vaccination or 80% vaccination, and once each state and territory is at that same level, we expect us to transition to the greater degree of openness, fewer lockdowns, no restrictions on international travel. Now, what's concerned me over the last week or two is we've heard some state premiers saying, well, even when those targets are met, what they've agreed to at the National Cabinet, what the Doherty Institute has modelled, they might still decide not to play ball. And that's the situation where I don't think we in New South Wales or indeed any other state should be prevented from opening up. I don't see why we need to be held back if other states are reneging on the agreement they made at the National Cabinet. I don't think our public would expect us to either.
No, indeed. It was just a couple of weeks ago that Josh Frydenberg stood up in Canberra with the Doherty modelling, Treasury modelling that overlaid that and said short, sharp lockdowns are the most cost-effective way to handle this virus. Do you think that is still the case when we see what's happening in Victoria? Not, thousands of cases, not hundreds, but certainly double digits. And Daniel Andrews couldn't have locked down harder or faster, and they're 4 weeks in to this lockdown.
Yeah, look, I think what's changed here is the Delta variant. I mean, it's somewhere between 4 to 6 times as infectious as the original variant, the Wuhan variant, and at least twice as infectious as the Alpha variant. And what we're seeing as a result is that the public health measures and the lockdowns and the social distancing restrictions that may have worked with the earlier variants are just not working with the Delta variant. I mean, New Zealand, 83 new cases, and they're in a pretty fierce lockdown. Victoria, 92 cases, I think, on Saturday, 73 cases yesterday. They're basically tracking the New South Wales outbreak in terms of the number of new infections and new cases. So I think that shows you that, and it's natural enough, but this virus has evolved and changed. And with the new variant, what may have worked on earlier variants is not working now. And I think that's why in New South Wales, it's pretty clear the strategy has changed. It's to suppress the virus and contain the breakouts, but accelerate on the vaccination, because that's ultimately the only way we'll live with this. And that's, of course, the experience overseas as well. I mean, Israel and the United Kingdom, both countries with well over 75% of their eligible adult population vaccinated, have not been able to control the Delta variant. It's still right, but what vaccination is doing is protecting the people and making sure that the death rate, the mortality rate, is much lower, even though you've got a high number of infections. And that's ultimately the pathway that the Doherty Institute maps out for us, is to live safely with this virus.
Yeah, and look, we hear the West Australian Premier, West Australia, by the way, and I know a lot of West Australians watch this program, they're living pretty normally, like we were, 10, 11 weeks ago in Sydney. And you tend to forget that, COVID exists around the world. But the reality of living with COVID, I think in states with zero COVID, is not at the forefront of their minds. But when you look at the economic reality of it, I mean, no international students into New South Wales. That hasn't happened for about 2 years. And also the transfer of skills across borders, I mean, that's going to become an issue, isn't it?
Yeah, look, and I think in Western Australia in particular, I mean, I know their economy is doing well, and because the resources trade is doing well and because iron ore prices are at record highs, but there are huge workforce and skill shortage pressures, particularly in Western Australia, but elsewhere across the Australian economy, because, traditionally we import a large amount of labour. As students, as guest workers, as working holiday makers, we're seeing it in our rural and agricultural sectors where, it's hard to get people to pick fruit on farms and do agricultural work. But we're also seeing it increasingly in the resources sector because, as you said, I mean, WA can't even import labour from interstate at the moment because of public health restrictions, and that's ultimately going to have a big crimp on economic activity. So the picture now might look okay at a sort of tactical level, but if you project forward 6 to 12 months, I don't think the economy will be able to cope well with this.
It's a really difficult political I guess, puzzle as well. You have, border towns like Mungandai, for example. Most of the population is separated from the local hospital in this town. But Western Australia and Queensland have recently had elections, and essentially those premiers have been rewarded for lockdowns and locking down states and closing borders. Do you accept that?
I do accept that, but I think that was probably a different time in this pandemic. I mean, when those elections were held, the vaccine had not been developed, had only just been developed. The world had not found a pathway out of this. The images from around the world that people were dealing with were, hospitals overflowing and mass cemeteries and things like that. Now, of course, it's quite different. You look around the world and people are travelling again, and people are holidaying again, and people are moving overseas for university, and people are visiting their family again. And I think the public now looks at that and says, well, when's that going to happen in Australia? And the answer is when we reach the Doherty Institute modelling target. So I think, look, the public mood on this crisis has understandably enough changed quite considerably. And I think whereas we might have been quite conservatively minded in the sense we didn't want to take risks because there were too many unknowns earlier in the year and certainly last year. I think now people can see a pathway ahead because it's been followed overseas, and that's the pathway people increasingly want to go down. And
just quickly, because I know you've got a lot of small businesses in your electorate, particularly in hospitality, and essentially right across the board. We're 10 weeks into lockdown now. The grants were given at the beginning. Some businesses aren't eligible to that ongoing JobSaver payment. Do we need to have another look at this?
I think we always need to be looking pretty closely at this. I mean, some small businesses are managing through this. Some are still able to trade, some have pivoted, but some can't at all. And particularly in my electorate, I'm conscious of people who are involved in like the live events business or the creative industries and things like that, where sometimes because of the way they're structured, they haven't been eligible for JobSaver and other payments, and they've needed other support. But of course, the longer this goes on, even businesses that are managing through this, they're considerably down in revenue and turnover. Sometimes they're burning through savings. Sometimes they're needing to go to the bank and take new loans, and they need to know that this is going to be
you're lucky if you can afford to take another loan, aren't you?
Oh, absolutely.
Not many people are lucky enough to be in that situation.
Absolutely. Although, I mean, we have just introduced a scheme of, small and medium enterprise loans, which is 80% underwritten by us, the Commonwealth, and gives people a 24-month deferral on repayments. But no, it's difficult. And I think if people know it's only going to be another, 6 to 12 weeks for argument's sake, and I think that's where we are in New South Wales, then I think they know, well, look, it's worth hanging on. It's worth keeping our employees. It's worth keeping our tenancy. But if people think it's going to be 3 to 4 months, it's a different proposition. And, I think the way vaccinations are going in New South Wales and the signposts that the Premier has put on the way out of this, I think shows us that businesses can see there's a horizon there, and we're getting closer and closer to it. And it's if they can make it there, then they'll get back to something resembling normal trading quite soon.
Yeah, we hope so. All right, Dave Sharma, thanks so much.
Thanks, Laura. Good to join you.